My husband had been dead for only 6 hours when my mother-in-law told me to pack my bags. I was still wearing the same clothes I'd had on in the hospital waiting room, still hadn't eaten anything since the previous morning, still hadn't figured out how to tell our 7-year-old son that his father wasn't coming home, when Alina Whitfield walked into the house I'd shared with her son for 11 years, looked around the living room like she was assessing a property listing, and said, "You'll need to start thinking about where you and Caleb are going to live now. This house was always meant to stay with the family." I want you to remember that phrase, meant to stay with the family, because 8 weeks later, Alina was going to sit across a courtroom table from her own attorney and learn that the family this house actually belonged to had never included her at all, and that the woman she'd tried to evict from her own dead son's house had spent every single one of those 8 weeks quietly building the exact kind of case that would end permanently. Whatever plans she'd already started making before his body was even cold. Welcome back to Silent Mirror Stories, where hidden truths finally find their reflection, and quiet people discover that silence often protects the strongest evidence. If you've ever been treated like you were disposable the moment your grief became inconvenient to someone else's plans, this story is for you. Stay with me until the end, because I promise you, it gets considerably worse before it gets better, and it gets considerably better than you're probably imagining right now. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I was 34 years old the day my husband Daniel died. I need to take you back further than that morning, though, because I don't think this story makes sense unless you understand exactly what kind of family I'd married into, and exactly how long certain things had been building underneath a surface that, to almost everyone outside our immediate family, looked completely normal. I grew up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, the only daughter of a high school math teacher and a nurse, a modest, stable childhood that taught me, more than anything else, the specific value of showing up consistently for people rather than performing love loudly and inconsistently. I studied occupational therapy in college and built a genuinely fulfilling career working with children with developmental delays, work that required an enormous amount of patience and a specific kind of quiet, steady presence that I think, looking back now, prepared me considerably more for what eventually happened in my marriage than I ever could have anticipated at the time. I met Daniel Whitfield when I was 26 at a mutual friend's barbecue in Des Moines, where he'd moved for a position at a regional engineering firm. He was warm, funny, and considerably more emotionally available than most men I'd dated up to that point, and I want to be honest that falling in love with him was easy, uncomplicated, the specific kind of relationship that develops without any dramatic obstacles. Simply two people who genuinely liked spending time together deciding, gradually, that they wanted to keep doing it. I met Daniel's mother, Alina, roughly 4 months into our relationship. At a dinner Daniel had clearly been nervous about arranging, a nervousness I didn't fully understand until I actually sat across from her myself. Alina was sharp, elegant in a specific, controlled way, and possessed a particular skill for delivering criticism wrapped so thoroughly in politeness that you sometimes didn't recognize you'd been criticized until hours later, replaying the conversation in your head. That first dinner, she asked me about my career with what I initially read as genuine interest, before pivoting, smoothly, toward a comment about how practical occupational therapy must be, compared, she noted, to what she'd always imagined for Daniel, someone with a bit more ambition career-wise. Daniel, I noticed even then, laughed this off nervously rather than defending either of us directly, a pattern I'd come to recognize, over the following decade, as absolutely central to understanding everything that eventually happened in our marriage. I want to describe Daniel's father, Robert, briefly, because his own role in this family dynamic matters considerably. Robert was quiet, generally deferential to Alina in almost every visible decision, a man who I genuinely liked on his own merits, warm in small, private moments, but who I never once, across 11 years, saw meaningfully push back against his wife's specific management of the entire family's emotional and financial landscape. Daniel and I married when I was 28, a wedding that Alina, I want to be honest, managed to insert herself into with a specific intensity that generated considerable tension between Daniel and me in the months leading up to it. Disagreements about venue, about guest lists, about a dress she suggested I consider instead of the one I'd already chosen. Each disagreement small enough on its own to seem unreasonable to complain about, but that, stacked together, revealed a pattern I chose, at the time, to interpret generously as simply a mother's understandable difficulty letting go of her only son. I want to describe the specific financial arrangement surrounding our first house, because it matters enormously to everything that eventually happened regarding that eviction threat. Daniel and I purchased our house 4 years into our marriage, a modest 3-bedroom home in a good school district outside Des Moines, financed primarily through our own combined savings and a standard mortgage, with a specific but modest gift from my own parents toward the down payment, roughly $15,000 that represented years of careful saving on their part. Alina and Robert, I want to be honest, contributed nothing directly toward that purchase, though Alina, over the following years, developed a specific habit of referring to the house, at family gatherings, as the Whitfield house, a phrasing I initially dismissed as simply a careless verbal habit rather than anything reflecting an actual, deliberate belief about ownership, a dismissal that turned out to be a genuine mistake on my part. Our son, Caleb, was born when I was 30, and I want to describe honestly how Alina's involvement in his life developed, because it shaped considerably more of the eventual conflict than I initially appreciated. Alina inserted herself into Caleb's upbringing with a specific intensity, frequent unannounced visits, opinions about everything from his diet to his eventual schooling, opinions delivered with a confidence that made disagreeing feel, somehow, disproportionately confrontational. I raised concerns about this dynamic with Daniel on multiple occasions throughout those years. Conversations that generally ended the same way, Daniel acknowledging, gently, that his mother could be a lot, while also asking me, consistently, to simply be patient with her, to understand that she meant well even when her delivery was difficult, a request I honored year after year, out of genuine love for my husband and a genuine desire to keep peace within our family. I want to describe Daniel's diagnosis, because the following 18 months shaped everything about how this eventual conflict unfolded. Daniel was diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, a diagnosis that transformed our entire family's daily existence almost immediately. Treatment schedules, hospital stays, the specific exhausting labor of caring for someone you love, while also trying to maintain some semblance of normal life for a young child watching his father grow visibly sicker. I want to be honest about Alina's behavior during this period, because it revealed patterns that would matter enormously to everything that eventually happened. Rather than becoming a genuine source of support during this crisis, Alina's involvement grew increasingly focused on what I can only describe as positioning herself, repeatedly suggesting, during Daniel's various hospital stays, that perhaps I wasn't equipped to handle the medical decisions being made, that perhaps she and Robert should be more directly involved in managing Daniel's care, and increasingly, in managing decisions about our household finances during a period when my own attention was, understandably, consumed by keeping my husband alive. I want to describe one specific conversation, roughly 8 months before Daniel's death, because it foreshadowed everything that eventually happened. During a particularly difficult hospital stay, Alina pulled me aside in a hallway and told me, with what she clearly intended as helpful directness, that I should start thinking practically about what would happen to the house and to Caleb if things don't go well. A phrase so chilling in its specific premature calculation that I genuinely didn't know how to respond in the moment. Simply walking away, rather than escalating a confrontation, while my husband lay in a hospital bed a few rooms away. Daniel passed 11 months ago, at home, exactly the way he'd wanted, surrounded by hospice care and by me, holding his hand through his final hours. I want to describe the specific texture of that morning, because I think you need to understand exactly how raw and exhausted I was when Alina arrived at our house that same afternoon, unannounced, still in the clothes I'd worn through the previous night, having not slept in over 30 hours, Having just made the specific, devastating phone calls to funeral homes that nobody should ever have to make while their child is asking, in the next room, where Daddy went. Alina arrived at roughly 2 in the afternoon, 6 hours after Daniel had passed, and I want to describe that specific confrontation in detail because I've replayed it many times since, and I think every detail matters. She walked into the living room, looked around, and said, without any preamble, "You'll need to start thinking about where you and Caleb are going to live now. This house was always meant to stay with the family." I told her, my voice considerably weaker than I wanted it to be given how exhausted and devastated I genuinely was, that this was my house, that Daniel and I had purchased it together, and that I had no intention of going anywhere. Alina's response revealed, with a clarity I'd never quite seen before, exactly how long she'd apparently been planning this specific conversation. She told me that Daniel had, in fact, discussed with her, privately, his wishes regarding the house's eventual disposition, mentioning, specifically, that he'd wanted it to remain in trust for Caleb, managed by his own parents, rather than remaining under my direct, sole ownership. I want to be honest about what I felt hearing this, because it matters to understanding everything I did afterward. I felt, in that exact moment, a specific kind of cold, disorienting shock, understanding that Alina was either lying outright, or that Daniel had had some conversation with her I'd never been told about, a possibility that, even in my grief, I genuinely couldn't fully believe, given how thoroughly Daniel and I had discussed our own estate planning together, years earlier, with our own attorney. I told Alina I needed her to leave, that this wasn't the day for this conversation, and she left, though not before telling me at the door that she'd be in touch soon about next steps, a phrase that hung over me for the following several days like a specific, quiet threat I didn't yet fully understand the shape of. I want to describe the following 2 weeks honestly, because I think the specific escalation matters considerably to understanding everything that eventually happened. Alina called repeatedly, each call carrying a specific, increasingly direct pressure, mentioning attorneys, mentioning Caleb's best interests, mentioning, at one point, that she and Robert had always understood the house would eventually pass to them for Caleb's benefit rather than remaining simply mine. I want to describe the specific moment when this escalated from uncomfortable pressure into something considerably more alarming. Roughly 3 weeks after Daniel's funeral, I received a certified letter from an attorney representing Alina and Robert, formally asserting a claim that Daniel had executed a handwritten codicil to his will, roughly 4 months before his death, during one of his hospital stays, leaving the house specifically in trust for Caleb, with Alina and Robert designated as trustees, a document that, according to this letter, effectively gave them substantial legal authority over the property and, functionally, over significant decisions regarding Caleb's upbringing until he reached adulthood. I want to be honest about what I felt reading this letter, because I think it matters to understanding my subsequent, deliberately methodical response. I felt genuine terror, initially, a fear that somehow, during a period when I'd been so consumed by caring for my dying husband, some legal document had actually been created that I'd never known about. A fear that kept me awake for several nights before I made the deliberate decision to approach this crisis the way I approach every genuinely difficult problem in my professional life, methodically. Gathering every piece of actual documentation before reacting emotionally to what I was being told. I contacted our family's own estate attorney immediately, a careful, thorough woman named Patricia Alvarez who had handled Daniel's and my original estate planning years earlier. Patricia confirmed within days, something that gave me my first genuine sense of solid ground since Daniel's death. Our house's title remained entirely, solely in my name, transferred that way specifically when we'd refinanced 2 years earlier, a detail I remembered clearly once Patricia mentioned it, and Daniel's actual, formally executed will, which Patricia herself had drafted and which remained on file at her office, contained absolutely no provision whatsoever regarding any trust arrangement for Caleb involving Alina and Robert. I want to describe the specific alleged codicil more carefully, because understanding exactly what Alina was claiming matters considerably to everything that eventually unfolded. The document Alina's attorney had referenced was supposedly a handwritten note, purportedly signed by Daniel during a hospital stay, witnessed, according to the letter, by a hospital chaplain whose name I didn't recognize. A document that, if genuine, would have represented an extremely unusual and legally complicated situation. A handwritten amendment to an already formally executed will, created during a hospitalization for an illness that, by that point, had already begun affecting Daniel's cognitive clarity considerably. I want to be honest about the specific decision I made at this point, because I think it reveals something important about how I chose to handle what I genuinely believed, even then, was likely some combination of Alina's own wishful thinking and outright fabrication. I decided not to immediately confront Alina directly with accusations of fraud, understanding, professionally, that I needed considerably more concrete evidence before making any such claim formally, and understanding, personally, that direct confrontation, without solid ground beneath me, would simply generate an emotionally exhausting fight I wasn't yet prepared to win decisively. I want to describe the following several weeks of investigation, because I think the specific work matters enormously to understanding exactly how this eventually resolved. Working with Patricia, I began systematically requesting Daniel's complete hospital records from the specific stay Alina's attorney had referenced, records that took several weeks to obtain, but that eventually revealed something genuinely important. According to the hospital's own detailed medical documentation, Daniel had been under heavy sedation for pain management during nearly the entire duration of that specific hospitalization. Records that included specific physician notes documenting periods of significant cognitive impairment and confusion, directly tied to his medication regimen during exactly the window when Alina's alleged codicil claimed he'd been lucid enough to compose and sign a legally meaningful document. I want to describe the specific moment when Patricia and I identified the chaplain named as a witness on Alina's alleged document, because this detail ultimately became central to everything that followed. The hospital's chaplaincy department confirmed, after Patricia's formal records request, that no chaplain by that specific name had ever been employed at that hospital, a discovery that transformed this situation, immediately and unmistakably, from a painful family dispute into something considerably more serious, a likely instance of outright document fraud. I want to describe how I felt receiving this confirmation, because I think it matters to understanding everything I did next. I felt, honestly, a specific kind of cold, focused clarity replacing the fear I'd carried for the preceding weeks, understanding, clearly, that Alina had apparently fabricated an entire document, invented a witness, and attempted to use my husband's death and my own grief as the specific window in which to seize control of both my house and, functionally, considerable influence over my son's life. I want to describe the decision I made regarding how to proceed, because I think it reveals something important about the specific patience I brought to this entire situation. Rather than immediately confronting Alina with this fraud, Patricia and I made the deliberate choice to build our complete case first, formally documenting the medical records, the chaplain's non-existence, and working with a forensic document examiner Patricia retained, obtaining a formal analysis of the handwriting on Alina's submitted codicil itself. I want to describe what that forensic analysis revealed, because it's the detail that eventually made this entire fraud undeniable. The examiner's report concluded, with a high degree of confidence, that the handwriting on the alleged codicil didn't actually match verified samples of Daniel's own handwriting from that same general period, showing specific, consistent differences in letter formation that the examiner testified were inconsistent with genuine authorship. Differences that, combined with everything else Patricia and I had uncovered, painted an increasingly clear picture of exactly what Alina had apparently done. I want to describe the specific weeks during this investigation, because Alina's continued pressure during this period reveals exactly how confident she remained in her fabricated claim. She called repeatedly, escalating her language, at one point telling me directly that if I didn't cooperate with transferring the trust arrangement, she would pursue full custody proceedings regarding Caleb, arguing that I was an unfit, unstable single mother incapable of managing both grief and appropriate parenting. Threats I documented carefully, every single call, every specific claim, understanding professionally exactly how valuable this contemporaneous documentation would eventually become. I want to describe the specific moment when I decided the investigation was complete enough to formally respond, roughly 7 weeks after Daniel's death. Patricia and I filed a formal response to Alina's attorney, not simply denying her claim, but presenting, directly and comprehensively, the complete evidence we'd assembled, the medical records showing Daniel's documented incapacity during the alleged signing period, the confirmation that the named witnessing chaplain had never existed, and the forensic handwriting analysis definitively contradicting the document's claimed authorship. I want to describe Alina's reaction once her own attorney received this response, because I understand, secondhand through the subsequent legal proceedings, exactly how this unfolded. Her attorney, upon reviewing our evidence, apparently withdrew from representing her almost immediately, recognizing, professionally, the considerable legal exposure continuing to pursue this fraudulent claim would create, both for Alina personally and for himself as an attorney who'd unknowingly submitted a fabricated document to formal legal proceedings. I want to describe the specific formal meeting that eventually occurred. Roughly 8 weeks after Daniel's death, in Patricia's office, with Alina, now representing herself, present alongside Robert, who I want to note had remained largely silent throughout this entire escalating conflict. A silence that, by this point, I understood as its own specific kind of complicity rather than simple deference. I want to describe that meeting honestly, because I think the specific details matter to understanding exactly how this entire situation finally resolved. Patricia presented our complete evidence directly, methodically, the medical documentation, the non-existent chaplain, the forensic handwriting analysis, laying out clearly that continuing to pursue this claim would very likely result in formal fraud charges being filed, given how thoroughly deliberate and calculated the fabrication appeared to be. I want to describe Alina's reaction because it revealed something genuinely important about the entire situation. She moved through several stages: initial defensive denial, insisting the document was genuine before, gradually, as Patricia walked through each specific piece of evidence in unflinching detail, settling into a kind of visible, stunned silence, understanding, I believe, in that exact moment, that whatever confidence had carried her through the preceding 2 months had been built entirely on an assumption that nobody would ever actually check the details closely enough to catch her. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I don't think a fully clean, prosecutorial resolution accurately represents how this situation ultimately concluded, though I want to describe exactly what did happen and why. Rather than immediately pursuing formal criminal fraud charges, a path Patricia confirmed remained genuinely available to me, I made the deliberate decision to instead require, as a condition of not pursuing that criminal path, a formal, legally binding agreement, drafted by Patricia and reviewed by Alina's own newly retained attorney, in which Alina and Robert formally acknowledged the codicil's fabrication, formally withdrew any and all claims to the house or to any trust arrangement involving Caleb, and agreed to specific, limited, supervised visitation terms going forward, terms structured entirely around Caleb's genuine well-being rather than around any ongoing family power dynamic. I want to explain why I chose this path rather than pursuing the criminal charges that were genuinely available to me. I thought considerably about what Caleb would eventually need to understand about his grandmother as he grew older, and I decided that a formal, documented acknowledgement of exactly what she'd done, permanently on record, protecting both the house and my full parental authority, mattered more to me than watching her face criminal prosecution, a decision that, I want to be honest, still generates some complicated feelings even now. Wondering whether I was too generous, given the calculated cruelty of what she'd actually attempted. I want to describe where things stand now, several months out from that final meeting in Patricia's office. Eleanor and Robert see Caleb occasionally, under terms that remain entirely within my control, visits that happen when I decide they're appropriate, structured around Caleb's needs rather than around any expectation Eleanor might otherwise still harbor. Our relationship remains, understandably, completely different than it was before Daniel's death, formal and careful rather than anything resembling family warmth, a distance I've made peace with, understanding it as the direct, unavoidable consequence of what she chose to attempt during the single most vulnerable moment of my entire life. I still keep the complete case file, Patricia's records, the forensic handwriting analysis, the hospital documentation, stored carefully in a safe deposit box, not out of any ongoing bitterness exactly, but as a specific, permanent reminder of something I learned during those 8 weeks, that grief makes you vulnerable in ways predators, even ones wearing the specific mask of family, will absolutely exploit if given the chance. And that the only real protection against that exploitation is patient, methodical documentation, gathered quietly, before you ever say a single word revealing what you actually know. My mother-in-law told me to pack my bags 6 hours after my husband died, certain that my grief would keep me too disoriented to ever seriously question whatever she claimed he'd wanted instead. What she discovered, 8 weeks later, in a quiet law office rather than any courtroom, was that the daughter-in-law she'd assumed would simply collapse under grief had instead spent every single one of those weeks proving, beyond any possible dispute, that the entire foundation of her plan had been fabricated from the very beginning, using a chaplain who'd never existed and a signature that had never actually belonged to the son she'd apparently decided to exploit even in death. That's my story. One devastating afternoon, 8 weeks of quiet, methodical evidence gathering, and a fraud that finally collapsed under the weight of documentation Eleanor never imagined I was capable of assembling. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Silent Mirror Stories, where every reflection reveals another hidden truth. Tell me in the comments, would you have pursued criminal charges or handled it the way I did? And if you've ever had someone try to exploit your grief the moment it became convenient for them, I hope you found something in this that reflected back at you clearly.